Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this Uncharted Waters webinar with conversation with Scott Phillips. I'm David Thomas. I'm a professor in the Gustavson School of Business at University of Victoria. Before we start, I'd like to share Uvic's territory acknowledgement with you. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. I encourage all of you to take a moment to consider where you are and currently located and the relationship of indigenous peoples with this land. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Scott Phillips. Scott's training is as an engineering physics from the University of British Columbia. Under his leadership, StarFish Medical has grown into a diverse professional organization with clients around the world focusing on medical devices. Scott's chair of the Life Sciences British Columbia Board, a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, winner of the EY Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 2017 in the Pacific Awards category, and the 2017 recipient of the Viatech Technology Champion Award. So suffice it to say, he's an award-winning kind of guy. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. And I don't often get to talk to international business audience, so this should be a lot of fun.
We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Many people will have heard of StarFish Medical, in particular with regard to how you brought together a network of manufacturers and suppliers to quickly design and manufacture a full-feature ICU ventilator here in Canada in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Your company describes itself as a medical device design and service provider. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, sure. It's a kind of a specialized niche industry. So the overall medical device industry in North America is something in the $100 to $200 billion a year range, and so those companies that sell medical devices need design services to support them. A lot of them are startup companies. They don't want to staff up their equity finance. They want to get to a high value and then exit to one of the strategic providers in the sector, or maybe they are one of the strategic providers and they need a next generation or some advice about their options or something like that. So it's in the product definition, product development, manufacturing transfer support area.
So does this involve venture capital, or do they already come to you with that sort of thing in train?
Yeah, so we don't provide venture capital, but we work often with the venture capital companies, or the venture capital companies will finance a company, or maybe they come to us prior to having venture capital and they would like to get to a they'd like to get through their friends and family to the angel rounds and then build themselves to the state where they can attract their first $5 to $10 million round. And so our job is to get them there, try to get them valuable and in as efficient a way as possible so they cannot take too much dilution. So I can talk about that sort of value creation piece. It's sort of, in some ways, we're like Accenture for medical devices. We consult on strategy and particularly relating to the product itself and what the right product is, what the IP landscape is, how to work through that, what the regulatory path might be, how to define the right business so that you can qualify for the right reimbursements and you can get your margins right. There's this whole range of things that go into defining a successful medical device company. We help companies with that.
Right. So it doesn't involve manufacturer then. Do you take them up to the point of manufacture, or do you go on?
We actually have a manufacturing plant here in Victoria, another one in Toronto. Although our role in the manufacturing is more of the early manufacturing, low volume manufacturing, and the consulting around that, what we call NPI, new product introduction. Because once you've launched your thing to start with, there's still plenty of potential to make your company 2 to 5 times more valuable, depending on what you do next. And so we want to be there to support that, and so that we can get them to the point of being established in the market and validating their market so that they can sell for top dollar to a company that's more in the distribution business.
I see. Okay. I should mention, by the way, that we have the Q&A open. So if participants have questions for either Scott or me, preferably Scott, if you'll put it in the Q&A, then we'll try to get to that before the session's over. Also, that has a function where you can vote for a question, which will move it up to the top. So if you see a question you like, you don't have to ask it again. You can just vote for it. Some of the immediate effects of the global pandemic have been fairly apparent. You know, some industries have experienced huge negative effects, and airlines, cruise lines, small consumer related businesses, and those sorts of things. While others, online retailers, technology companies like the Zoom platform we're using at the moment, have had upswings. What have been the most dramatic effects on StarFish Medical and the medical device industry?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, I mean, of course, all sorts of things, but we went virtual in March, largely for internal meetings and so on. We've always been virtual for our clients, so we don't really have any customers locally. British Columbia is around 3% of our business right now, for example. So it actually interesting, and that's quite different from most of our competitors who are scattered around North America. Typically, they have quite a substantial local market. So we've always had to fight against that, which in some ways is a paradoxical benefit. But what we found in the pandemic is that the buyers are more willing to buy remotely, which is actually kind of surprising. Because you imagine our typical buyer, a startup company, they've raised their first $1 million. They want to sell themselves ultimately for $100 million, and they're going to spend $20 or $30 million getting there. So engaging a company to advise them and to do all the design and spend millions of dollars on what we do, it's a huge risk for them, right? Imagine doing that without ever being able to meet them. And but we've closed a number of jobs with remotely. So that's actually that was a big risk at the beginning, because here we are stuck across, mostly in Canada, and most of our clients are in the US. So, and we can't visit them easily. So it's that was a risk that maybe we'd have real sales problems, but so far we haven't really seen that.
So it positioned you well for the response to the pandemic.
Well, that's ironic, actually. I think everybody in Victoria or in other sort of remoter centers are contemplating, doing business in the greater world. Everybody should be doing that, and it's a bit of a hurdle to get across as you develop your business. To how do you go out and find the very best customers anywhere in the world that you might want, and but now is the time when people are more open to that than they have been.
What about the broader effects on the industry? I mean, is there higher demand for medical devices, or?
We have not, interestingly, we expected that there would be some slowdown just because there would be slowdowns in people affording care and all sorts of things ultimately ripple back up. And maybe we also sell to an industry that depends on equity financing. So sort of interest in risk taking. So far, we're busier than ever. We're planning to add 30 staff members this next year based on our projections and the level of interest we have right now. So there's definitely a lot of equity financing going on. So, there's parts of that industry, which we can talk about later, that, of course, things that relate to COVID are getting a big boost. Things that relate to remote healthcare are also getting a boost. But we're seeing across the board, things to do with whatever, diagnosing liver disease or finding brain cancer. They're still marching along just like before. So.
Wow, interesting. Rapid advances in technology are often the result of responses to events in the external environment. What kind of developments have you seen in the medical device industry that have resulted or are resulting from the pandemic? Are there specific things where you've
Mhm.
seen dramatic moves? Obviously, the vaccine
Yeah,
is
vaccine,
something
although
that's on
that's not
everybody's
so.
mind, but
Yeah,
that's
that's
not in your
interesting.
field.
Not in my field, no.
Have you seen things that have resulted as a result of the response?
So one of the things that really has changed rapidly is a field that people have been beating their heads against the wall for 10 years on remote health. So that, and it hasn't mostly been a technology problem. It's really been a reimbursement problem. Our industry is heavily governed by how people get paid for things, right? And it's not like selling sewing machines or 2x4s. That there's a lot of regulation on how much people pay or how much get reimbursement, how much pay there is for different medical things. And up to now, like Health Canada has not been willing to pay for remote visits, right? And all of a sudden, and just like overnight, everything changed. My wife's a family doctor, so she does a lot of remote visits, and all of a sudden, I think that will open the floodgates to a whole raft of remote monitoring technologies and business models around that. And you think that medical devices is about 3% of the whole medical spend. The vast majority is people, right? And so it's other than that, there will be rapid assays. That's going to be a huge thing. I think obviously personal protective things, but also like air purifiers and stuff. There'll be a whole raft of things that cater to trying to get people back to the office. And I think that you can sort of see them lined up on the horizon. But in terms of our personal experience, I can't say that other than a few particular COVID-related projects, including one giant one. It's hard for us to read the tea leaves and see a pattern of a particular shift in the industry.
The remote aspect of delivering medical care is fascinating, because I've noticed that myself, is that now I can actually talk to a family doctor. I was having trouble here on the island talking to a family doctor, but now it became pretty easy. And as you point out, is the willingness of government to pay for that was the driver. Right?
That was totally the driver. And there will be people take advantage and so on, but the vast majority of it will just be more convenient care, which is what everybody should have wanted to start with.
Right, good. As someone who teaches international business, I've been especially interested in the possible effects of the pandemic on the process of globalization. Right, the most pessimistic view seems to be that the process of globalization will be reversed, or at least paused, in the wake of the political nationalism and protectionism and that sort of thing, or that it will. The positive optimists suggest that the current trends in globalization will just be accentuated by what's going on in the pandemic. I'm wondering how the international aspects of StarFish's medical business has been affected, such as your international collaborations or supply chains and those sorts of things.
Yeah, so the short answer is not too much. Obviously, we were alarmed to see the slamming of borders over protective equipment early in the pandemic. That's sort of the whole promise, or the whole premise of countries specializing, doing what they did best. So that was the whole idea of free trade. That as soon as there was a hint of risk, all of a sudden government started hoarding all the stuff for their own citizens, right? I think there was one case where the US actually commandeered a shipment of face masks in Hong Kong on the premise that they were manufactured by an American headquartered company. And there was that they were destined for Germany. So that's kind of remarkable to see that the national borders became more relevant. I think, you're also seeing the rise of China. I think even in the last year, Western perceptions of China have dramatically worsened. And I think we can all see that there's going to be a new alignment of conflict in the world for the next 50 or 100 years. And so everybody's kind of taking note of that. Right. So that may be getting back to your earlier comment that sort of the existing trends maybe are just either sped up or slowed down based on the circumstances. But in practice, we do have a fair number of Chinese supply chains for some of our products, and those are still carrying on. Although I wouldn't be too surprised if over time they migrate to Vietnam or other places that are not China. So.
But you don't have critical aspects of your supply chain or those of your collaborators that have been affected.
Well, there's been lots of pinch points in the supply chain, so that when we designed the ventilator, for example, that the Canadian government hired us to do, we had critical shortages of everything, and plus they wanted it to be a largely Canadian initiative since it was paid for by the Canadian government. So we had to find things that we could buy, but a lot of specialty valves and microchips and so on, of course, aren't really made in Canada. So we had to essentially buy what we could obtain, and there was everybody in the world at that time was scrambling around to find ventilator parts. So we actually had to pursue a design strategy to be away from what everybody else was looking for, which was kind of our strategy.
Did you find that you that you were trying to source things locally or manufacture locally, those difficult to find design parts, or?
There's more specialty parts like valves and oxygen sensors and so on. I think oxygen sensors came from Europe. The valves came from wherever they came from. I don't remember, maybe Germany, but there's a lot in something like this. There's a lot of custom manufactured parts that we would design that are made. So those are primarily made in Canada, precision machined parts and frames and bases and electronic panels and so on for controls. So the vast majority of sort of the value add cost in the whole thing was Canadian.
Right. So, despite we've had some great news on vaccines over the past week. It's three vaccines out there. That's wonderful news. Makes me feel a lot better. But at this stage, we really don't know how the pandemic will play out or how long it'll take for those vaccines to be widely available. I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball a little bit here. What are your expectations about how the business environment's going to change going forward, both sort of short and long term?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So as I mentioned earlier, our particular business, people have just sort of adjusted, and we're just charging along as we were before, more or less, except not all in the office. My crystal ball, based on the being in the sector, it's more than vaccines. It's therapies, that sort of cocktails of therapies. You remember how AIDS kind of got picked away at over the course of 20 or 30 years until eventually it became just like a manageable chronic condition. I think we're seeing that, except instead of 20 years, it's 1 year. There's just so much initiative. It's all just crunched down, and so it won't be too long until. If you get COVID, you'll get a shot of something or other, and then it'll more or less go away, or at least be manageable. It won't progress to the lung inflammation that we see. So I think that will probably come even faster than the vaccines in terms of being broadly available. Then the other piece is rapid diagnostics, and everybody's thinking about rapid diagnostics a little bit wrong right now, I think, in that it's not so much about testing occasionally to see if you have it. It's about testing very rapidly to see if you're infectious. And so the faster tests where you just spit in a little vial and dump it on a little lateral flow thing like a pregnancy test kit, I think those will be quite cheap and quite widely available, and you can test every day. And then it won't necessarily tell you if you for sure don't have COVID, but it will tell you you're not able to infect people today, basically. So which is in practice what we really want to know, right?
And so we've seen the share market, stock market respond, very positively every time there's some good news on a vaccine or a different therapeutic treatment or something like that, and then fall off again at some bad news. But on average, what are you seeing in terms of your projections for the next few years?
a few years. Well, so I think that I think we'll be back to work as usual, more or less, towards the latter part of next year. I was just on a call organizing a conference. We're trying to organize it for June, and imagining that the environment will have shifted so that such that if we have rapid testing on site and the people are feeling less fretful about the consequences of catching COVID, and there's vaccines for the most vulnerable, that's kind of what I'm expecting. But there will be a long tail. There will be people who are compromised in some way, and that it'd be quite bad for them to catch COVID. And it will take a long time until a vaccine that has some long-term protection and is inexpensive and widely distributed is available for everybody. That will take years. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I often tell my students that organizations can respond to changes in the external environment by making changes in one of three areas, right? They can do something, they can change something about people, about processes, or structures of the organization. I wonder if there's specific changes that you've planned are dealing with for your projections in the future. For example, in 2019, StarFish Medical was described as one of Canada's fastest growing companies. Now, earlier on, you said you were adding 30 people. How's the pandemic influenced your future growth plans? Is it you're growing more rapidly, or?
Well, when you're in the expert services business, you only want to grow so fast, right? That there's been years where we grew 50% in the past, and now we're 21 years old, and we're only 140 people. So it's there's only been so much growth, but you got to have people to provide those services, and they've got to be integrated into the culture, because what we sell is super complicated. So we don't want to grow to the moon. We want to grow modestly every year. If we grew 10 or 20% per year, that would be great. 40% starts to be maybe some of the clients don't get the kind of expert treatment that we're hoping they're going to get, so on. So, but we're pretty strategic. Every year we take time to noodle on what our 5-year vision of ourselves is and what our specific goals are for the year and so on. So, I would say there's certain things, like we had planned to add a couple offices in the US, and we're hoping to make some progress in that this year, but it's hard to travel there. So that's basically got slowed down. We had this large ventilator program that government hired us for, and it's so large, it's larger than our company in terms of dollars, most of which is a flow through, but we're still expected to manage that large cash influx honorably, and to actually deliver the end product, right? So we actually structured a whole other company around that, just to manage such a large contract, and it will have 10 years of life to manage thousands of ventilators out in the field. So that's one thing. And we're just taking advantage. If there are less people in the office, that means you can do renovations. Which maybe that also tells you that we're not buying this notion that it's going to be a virtual world now and everybody's going to work from home. We don't believe that, not for this kind of work. We think that teamwork is best done with actual teams knowing each other and seeing each other in a variety of contexts, not just in sort of intense sort of business discussions. We just this week hired a new salesperson, sales VP based out of Boston. So that's been one of our strategies for a while, is to add more footprint in the East. So those are examples. We've got lots of other examples as well, but we're just chugging along, doing what we were hoping to do. But in some cases more accelerated, in some cases more slowed down by the circumstance.
So no dramatic changes in personnel or the structure of the company, or?
Not really. Actually one thing that we've had a strategy of bioservices, which is assays, so detected diseases, for example. And it's been on the books. We've had the group for 3-4 years, and it's been kind of slow growing. We were even trying to decide how we're going to decide if this is working or not, and this with a big crux point this year. And as of this year, also, we got a ton of interest in that, and we kept doubling down on it. We added some infrastructure in Toronto, specialty infrastructure for it. We hired a VP of sales who had a background in that area. So more than just COVID, but I think maybe will claim the brilliance of positioning that we happen to be sitting in a spot trying to grow a business that got dramatically amplified by COVID. So in that sense, we're adding a lot of capacity in that area.
I'm going to put my international business hat back on just for a moment, and I'm intrigued about the potential entry into the United States or establishing an office in the United States.
Yeah.
Even you said you'd been so successful virtually dealing with the United States, and of course, ultimately the borders will be back open and the opportunity will present itself. What will you gain? What do you think you'll gain, Scott, by
Sure.
What
will I gain by? Yeah, that's right. So actually, it's an interesting. Yeah, that's a great question. So what we're hoping to gain is essentially being able to triangulate. We want to be somewhat local, but not too much, because it's actually more cost effective to do development in Canada. So we want to preserve that benefit. It's sort of an arbitrage play. But clients genuinely do appreciate being able to have somebody they can see and talk to, physically drive over and visit. So our general plan is to have some customer-facing roles in the local markets and most of the product development work done here. So and there's a sort of a related question, which is how big do we want to get? Because can you do an innovative expert services business with 1,000 people? And we're kind of suspecting not so much. But even so, it behooves us to be the best company we can be and attract the best clients we can get. And at some point, if we face overexpansion problems, we can split, or we can just focus on the best business or something.
It's fascinating talking about the scalability of your particular type of business, right? I think that's a very interesting question, and one that I'll watch to see how you handle over the next
Thank you.
next little bit. So I think we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I'll encourage anyone who's any of you participating in the webinar, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll see if we can get some of these over the next few minutes. There's one, Scott, that says something about strategic measures adjusting to people being laid off, but I think we can probably skip that one because I don't think you laid anybody off.
We have not laid anybody off. No, we're trying to hire people. Although there's an interesting issue of when everybody's virtual here, it's easier to hire people in Vancouver, say, than in Victoria. Do we hire people? In fact, we just hired a new QA person this week in Vancouver, but knowing that they won't be coming to the office once COVID is passed, except, so how to trade that off? What's the culture that we want in the company post-COVID? How do we set ourselves up for that?
One of the, as you mentioned, what you do is these are very complicated endeavors. These are complicated products, and so you need smart people. And one of the advantages of operating virtually is you can get the smartest person, the best person, regardless of where they are anywhere in the world.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm wondering if that plays into your thinking now. I mean, what about somebody from Bulgaria or wherever?
That's right. I think we like people who are in similar time zones to us, because people, you don't understand, or yeah, sure you understand, but a lot of people don't understand just the degree of risk and uncertainty in an early development program. Like the thing, it could be all sorts of different embodiments, and the risks are often quite nuanced and complex. And so it's not something that you write down a list on a piece of paper and somebody else clearly does a job with it. There's a lot of complicated discussion going on. So I think you won't find us hiring Bulgarians or Indians, at least for that frontline work where we're trying to work with a client to figure out what we should do for them, and what the trade-offs of getting this prototype to work, and what are the risks to the patients and so on. But it could easily be we'd end up with a software team in Ukraine or something that where you can parse off a specific chunk of work that can be defined well enough they know what they're responsible for.
So along those lines, do you think people see you as a Canadian company, or do they even know where you are? Is that part of your?
That's actually kind of interesting. Americans can be a little funny that way. They like to buy from other Americans, as opposed to say Europeans that tend to see Europe as a more of a diverse and integrated place. So since most of our work is in the U.S., we tend to just present ourselves as non-national. We don't try to be American, but we don't wave our Canadian flag either. And as most Canadians have American cousins, then it's easy to find some sort of affinity to talk to Americans with.
Right, right. So we've got another question in the chat maybe we want to get to. It says you've mentioned the focus on startups, but how do you attract more traditional established players where in their innovation process does your firm add value?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do sell to those guys. And if I had a longer period of time, I'd talk about sort of our philosophy around value creation. For a startup company wants to get valuable periodically when they're trying to raise capital, right? And the most efficiently possible. With the larger corporation, what they really want is they've got all these gates that they've got a variety of different product ideas, and then they butt into these gates and they have to decide which ones get to move forward and get funded to the next level. So that's in some ways pretty analogous. We've done a variety of things. We're just doing a contract with a large corporate this week in the US, and they want us to do some early conceptual work. We had one a couple of years ago. It was a large corporation in surgical positioners for people getting hip surgery. So a big table. Imagine a giant complicated table with pivots and so on, and could pull on your leg. In that case, they had a 20-year-old product and they needed a next generation. And all the people who knew about that product were gone. Because what tends to happen in those larger corporations is the people who stick in them, they like to follow processes. They're very disciplined and at seeing a big picture and marching things through methodically, but the really innovative type people tend not to like that environment. So in some ways they need what we do at the earlier stage, and then often they'll choose to do the final design for manufacturability and transfer activities themselves.
Great. So here's one on teamwork. I thought this was an interesting question. Given what you said about the importance of teamwork and team members getting to know and work with each other in multiple contexts, how are you dealing with the challenge of integrating your new hires? You're going to hire 30 new ones, you told me earlier, and ensuring that they understand and experience important aspects of the company's culture, given the limitations of currently working virtually?
Yeah, so we try. We have a very active social committee. I think we'll be having a virtual Christmas event coming up in a couple of weeks, and everybody's getting a basket. And I know they've got some sort of a plan to have everybody open pieces of their basket in sequence and take pictures and send them to each other. So I'm not exactly sure what the plan is, but so we really try to get people connect. But it's actually, honestly, I feel like the magic of our culture, we've been quite magical for a long time, I feel it kind of diminishing, and it pains me. So I don't see, I think that there's a huge amount of trust, just team trust, people being able to work in super complicated things and with lots of risk, and you might be working on 3 or 4 programs at a time, and knowing that everyone's going to get the best thing in the world out of that. That's a very remarkable set of circumstances. I'm not willing to believe that can all happen with everybody sitting at home. As I say, we do our best, but I can't wait to get people back to the office.
We know actually from the research that developing and maintaining trust in a virtual environment is more difficult. And so it's not surprising to me that you would say that, and that you'd be anxious, particularly in the kind of work that you do, that you'd want to get them back in the office, at least initially, to engage.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll end up with probably more virtual. Like, we've always been pretty flexible in terms of somebody says, oh, I'm going to work at home today. That's generally been just fine. But there's a lot of just serving other people. That's part of your day-to-day job too, right? People just need a few words here and there about your impression of something they're doing or something like that. some of it's just not even planned. It just sort of happens. And some of it is actually just learning to emulate people, how they present themselves and carry themselves in the world, right? And if you're a junior or new staff person, you got as much of that to learn as anything else, right? And it's so hard to do when you just don't get to see them that much. So yeah, definitely I've talked to a variety of people who think they've discovered nirvana, that they're, that it's going to be all virtual now. And I'm honestly skeptical of that whole thing.
Yeah, we're talking a lot in the academic environment about, we learned a lot about teaching virtually and that sort of thing, and we're talking a lot about how much of that will transfer back to transfer back when we go back to in class and those sorts of things. So I think we're all going to be facing that that reality pretty soon.
Absolutely.
Here's another one for you. This is a global supply chain question. How would you see the global supply chain to be improved in preparation for another unpredictable global disruption?
That's an interesting question. I think generally I like the idea of global interdependency. That's just for geopolitical reasons. I think people who trade a lot probably don't fight quite so much. But that wasn't necessarily true of the British and the Germans in the Second World War. But it's not a rule. But it's, I think, by and large, if you got reasons to cooperate, then that sort of, there's other voices in the conversation about who wants to have fights about this and that. So I think that I can't say I'm really an expert on global supply chain and how it could be improved. It'd be nice to see a return to a sort of rules-based international order of trade as much as possible, but, as opposed to the Trumpian, let's just go beat up on one country at a time, that sort of view of the world that I don't think that's going to be good in the long term for the world if it's sort of the bullies rule the roost. But, so my broad thought is that there should be more international trade, and we should get back to how it was before. But
so you wouldn't see more trying to source things more locally?
Oh yeah, I think there's definitely will be a move to that. That there will certainly be, particularly governments will be saying to themselves, how can we make sure, as we anticipate different disaster scenarios, that we have adequate capacity in our country to satisfy that? And they won't depend on contracts. Well, it's okay because we got a contract with this Japanese company or this Chinese company to give us those things. Or most particularly with American companies these days, with who knows, if you get another return of another Republican government like Trump, then they won't be worrying about honoring those types of obligations. So I think it's such a fascinating time. I'm sure there will be, but I don't see the breakdown of international trade totally. I think by and large, the world is getting to be a smaller and smaller place as 5G arrives and whatever, more AI algorithms and stuff. I don't see that's going to thrive in an environment with a bunch of very tall national borders. I would hope that national borders become a little less important over time, not more.
I'm going to abuse my position as the moderator and ask what I think is going to be the last question of
Yes.
for today. Is you mentioned the fact that you were doing so much virtually had been an advantage as a result of responding to the pandemic. Did you have a contingency plan? Were you prepared? Did you have for external environmental threats, or were you just lucky?
I'll claim genius all the time, but I think honestly, our plan was if the U.S. border become very thick and we were having trouble with getting across it and with maintaining our business, we would have bought a U.S. operation.
Right. Well, I think we've just about exhausted our allotted time. Scott, I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk with us today. It's been very interesting and entertaining. I hope the participants have enjoyed it, and thank you all for attending. That is the end of our session for today.
Perfect.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Okay, goodbye.